morning and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new, welcome. Today I'm excited to take you on another behind the scenes look at my writing group. It is going to be starting at 2 p.m. today, and I've already emailed them ahead of time to let them know I'm going to be sharing chapter 4 and half of chapter 5 in my WIP. I've made so many changes to these two chapters, and I'm really looking for feedback as far as world building and clarity on how the technology is working, since this is a speculative fiction world. So hopefully we'll get some good feedback there and see if there's any places where I need to return in these chapters to make sure that the writing is as clear as possible before I dive back into the query trenches this year. So the last time we left off was with chapter 3. Cameron had just seen Tesla in the rain, and this picks up directly after with Cameron being at the academy, and it is Somnium Awareness Day, so that should be pretty interesting. So I'm going to read through chapter 4, and then I did include half of chapter 5 just because I've made huge edits to both chapters, and I'm really hoping that the world building and elements of Cameron's thesis, the changes that I've made, that hopefully it comes through in this chapter. Chapter 4. Inoculation stations loomed center stage. Cameron tried to avoid the preparations made in the cafetorium for Somnium Awareness Day. Sharp scent of antiseptic overtook the usual sweetness of fresh-baked blueberry nano-muffins. Any other Monday would have been manageable, but Cameron couldn't focus with the presence of Insomni and their scheduled presentations in equal proximity. She traversed the milling crowd of students instead of meeting her friends on the bleachers. "Cam, wait up." Kane joined halfway down the hall. His chroma lenses brought out the blue undertones in his dark skin, circles appearing deeper beneath his eyes. "We wanted coffee, but we were waiting for you." Headache. She pressed a finger to her locker, feeling the familiar hum of the imprint before it clicked open. He sighed. "And Niles talks too much." She nodded, searching for an ibuprofen patch in her bag. If only everything else could be fixed this way. "He's not back from his inoculation yet, but I'm sure he'll give me shit for my project title." Kane's words neared a whisper, filled with defeat. "It's only November." Cameron tried to sound hopeful. Kane smiled without exposing teeth. "You're the perfect person to help." "I was never the one who made things sound true." Cameron closed her locker door. Talking around who Lennox used to be hurt. "We should get you back." She didn't want Kane to miss his inoculation. It was difficult enough to deal with the ache in her arm without thinking about losing him next. He leaned against the locker beside her, playing with the buttons on the sleeve of his denim shirt. "I actually got my dose before the deadline. I know it's a first." Cameron meant to tell him about her own injection, but the possibility of disease would feel real if she explained. Until she heard from Rambert, it could wait. "I believe you mentioned coffee." She urged him down the hall with a smile. Back in the cafetorium, Kane led the way up the bleachers. Aislinn turned, hair unloosing from the knot at the base of her neck. She tucked strands dark as shadows back into place. Thank incendiaries. Am I the only one feeling completely corrupt over today's presentation? Kane looked overhead, storm swelling beyond the geodesic dome. He framed the rain-splattered glass between fingers. "I'm thinking anamorphosis for my title. It's a kind of distorted projection." The sky darkened, prompting an adjustment to the cafetorium's brightness. Faux freckles sparkled across Aislinn's nose and cheeks when the artificial light caught the colorful bits of glitter. She sighed. "Niles would say it could be better." She moved closer to Cameron. "How are you keeping steady right now?" Cameron couldn't claim this calm. She cleared her throat. "It's like how Graham used stories to survive." Aislinn tilted her head the other way, puzzling through the explanation. "You haven't said anything about today's proposal. Thoughts elsewhere, then?" "More than one place." Cameron massaged her temples, wincing at the twinge in her arm. "Coffee, then?" Aislinn stood, pulling Kane up with her. "We'll go. I need to walk off this energy." She blinked twice to place the order before squinting at Cameron in that way she did to show she understood. Her version of an effortless embrace. Aislinn followed Kane toward the cafe counter at the other end of the room. While she waited, Cameron tapped her knee 3 times. "Forget perfect." Niles sat beside her, playing with a hole at the bottom of his olive sweater. "Just tell me you have a better title for your project than the rest of us." "Words aren't so simple." She looked down, fearing he would dissect her discomfort, pinpointing the wound on her arm. They sat in quiet until Kane returned with a cup of coffee in each hand, offering one to Cameron. Niles tipped his chin. "Thanks for the coffee." Once narrowed, his eyes resembled seedlings, earthen and small. Only 2 hands here. Kane motioned behind him. Aislinn shook her head. Looks like your sweater met its end. This was my dad's. Niles took a cup from Aislinn. I'd like to enjoy my coffee now. He reclined back, extending legs on the bench ahead. I'll stay. Aislinn sat beside him. She ripped open 6 packets of sugar, sweetness cascading into dark depths. Cameron squinted back at Aislinn before following Kane to the stairwell. She wasted no time with her coffee on the way. I don't know how you drink that so fast without cream and sugar. Kane reached out a hand to her empty cup. Cameron took a deep breath. I'd blame it on needing caffeine, but it's something more. In the stairwell, the aroma of artisanal coffee stole her explanation. Cameron wanted to slip away unseen. Cammy? Lennox's question smelled like the espresso tablets she always chewed before first period. Today there was a hint of hazelnut. The first bell chimed. Lennox ran her hands down the fabric of her dress. I'll keep this quick, I promise. Though it had been 6 months since their last conversation, Lennox sounded just the same. Everything else changed. We'll be late for class. Cameron looked to Kane for confirmation. He took 2 steps up the stairs. I'll just see you in a few. I know this is weird. Lennox flipped her hair over one shoulder. The strands were longer, threaded with gold, like honey. Graham used to bring a jar of artificial honey for breakfast on Sundays. Those mornings, Lennox would pin her hair back, pretending at adulthood. Now the idea of tea parties felt childish. When Cameron didn't respond, Lennox continued. You know my mom lost the election, right? And you remember how much the fallowed scare me? You should talk to Namazani, Greek goddess of memory. Lennox sighed, arms held tight across her chest. This isn't like those games we played with Graham. You're right. Cameron looked away. This isn't a game. I was wondering if Maya could get me a good placement at the clinic this weekend, because I need the extra credit, but I can't go alone. And if she's there, even if she's Munis, at least it's something. Lennox always tried to ramble her way around the idea of disease. Cameron dragged the toe of her boot along the concrete. It'd be easier for us both if this was the River Lethe. Forgetting waters? Really? I never wanted this. Lennox shifted her weight to the other leg, leaning closer. Wish you felt the same. Cameron didn't respond. If she did, there would be no way to stop admitting all the things she still remembered. She started up the steps in an effort to put distance between her and Lennox. It was too difficult being like this now when they'd leave the stairwell a moment later without another reason to speak. Maybe you'd help if it were Kane, right? Lennox followed up one step. You're with him now? After everything you said to me? After you ruined everything? The second bell rang, but Cameron didn't move. Just so you know, with Kane, it's not like we're together. We've never been together. We're friends, but that doesn't change anything. Got it. Good to know. The finality of the conversation reminded Cameron how a different set of words destroyed the people they were a year ago. Lennox laughed, sound sharp. You know, you're like a penumbra. What does that even mean? Cameron missed how Lennox used terms the way some people said things like, it's Monday or it's raining. She said them like they had to be true. Before Lennox left, she looked back over her shoulder. You're only half the person you used to be. Chapter 5. Tingle of tech prickled at the back of Cameron's neck. Another step over the threshold initiated a connection between her lenses and the classroom feed. Once synced, today's presentation schedule showed names in alphabetical order. Cameron embraced the calm that came from counting those 3 students listed before her. The instructor turned from the center dais. Of all the days to be late. She appeared celestial, adjusting the jade scarf tied around her head, fabric pinpricked with a metallic sheen. Without another word, Chavez motioned for her and Lennox to follow back out to the hall. Cameron searched for something to say. The door clicked closed. Don't blame her. Lennox took a step forward. Chavez sighed. But neither of you arrived on time, which indicates equal culpability. Her words softened with disappointment. It won't happen again. Cameron kept her eyes on the floor, unable to meet her instructor's chromoless gaze. Despite the glint of gold makeup highlighted on her dark skin, Chavez looked lifeless. Sometimes Cameron imagined death made a home inside Graham's bones by forcing out her light. With a deep breath, Lennox resumed her explanation. I was feeling dizzy after my injection. Cameron was there every step of the way. She's the reason we're here. There was much to admire in the simplicity of this statement, but Cameron tapped her leg once and twice and again to keep the last sentence from echoing in her head. Those words were about more than how they arrived to class this morning. I was starting to think your previous instructors had it all wrong about you two. Chavez rested a hand at her throat. Certain friendships always stand out in the minds of the faculty, and they were sure you'd submit a project together. Her laughter brightened, and I couldn't understand until now. I guess we've grown since last year. Cameron swallowed down the unspoken word. They'd grown apart. Chavez swept the end of her scarf over one shoulder. Let's move along then. She opened the door without extending consequences for their delay. Before Cameron could return to the classroom, Lennox grabbed her elbow. Pain jolted through her arm. She stilled, unflinching. Never thought the day would bring us here. Lennox didn't move her hand. They couldn't have this easy friendship anymore. The reminder of what Cameron wanted them to be a year ago already stung. She stepped away. Good luck, Len. Recalling her father's words from the night before kept Cameron from looking back. Instead, she navigated to her table at the far end of the room. Escaping the stares of students remained impossible, but she focused on the 6 walls around her. 1 and 2 and 3. 1, 2, 3. She sank into her usual chair, moving closer to the edge of the round metal table. Across from her, Niles shook his head with a tisk. Of all the days to be late. Don't listen to Niles. Cameron, maybe the sentiment bears repeating? Kane, what happened with Lennox? Cameron, later. Cameron, presentations are starting. Cameron couldn't focus on the other proposals with Graham's voice in her head. How then did this begin? Somnium spread after honeybees disappeared. Without meaning, Cameron's thoughts circled back to the painting at the clinic. The injection and the bruise and the pain in her arm all ebbed in sets of 3. Repetition tightened in her chest until there was no space to fill her lungs. Chavez cleared her throat. Up next, Cameron Bishop. Snapped back to reality, Cameron took only one quick breath before crossing to the dais. 6 possible futures waited for her to make a choice. From the center of the hexagonal space, she decided to keep her own table in view. Dimming the transparency of her lenses allowed her to stay anchored by the silhouettes of her friends. There are still those who think about the world before. With 2 blinks, she accepted the classroom's request to access her presentation. If we could travel back to that point in history, we might understand how this began. Cameron didn't know what would happen to that autumn girl if she returned to before yesterday's injection. She wouldn't want to lose the memory, to unravel any part of this morning, however indistinct it might be now. Chavez stepped toward the dais. Please continue, Miss Bishop. Cameron apologized. She blinked fast to move to the next portion of her proposal. Time overlaps from past to present and beyond. To find a future free from somnium, we need to understand the intricacies of what led to these prions. She pushed her hair to the right, tucking it behind her ear. We know what we think we know, but I propose a beginning untarnished by stories. Graham's voice whispered her disapproval. We never know the people in stories, but that doesn't make them any less real. Those words only existed in Cameron's head. No need to defend herself. She cleared her throat. Our current cycle of insomnia injections is not a cure, rather momentum deferred. The crux of her argument was scientifically sound. Chavez wouldn't be able to deduct points from that section of the rubric. But Cameron needed to articulate the rest of her proposal in a way that correlated to the quantifiable improvement of somnium efforts. If only she could speak with enough conviction. Chavez would understand. Cameron's future away from the academy not only depended on her instructor. Dean Montgomery and Hack needed to find equal value in her words. Cameron wiped sweat from her palms on her jeans. She feared the next part would lose her audience. We must think about somnium as something more than disease. And how do you suppose we approach such a venture, Miss Bishop? Chavez tapped a knuckle against her chin, waiting for an answer. Cameron took a breath. Another. One more. We look instead to the endless possibilities of somnium as art. We map manipulation as a means to disrupt the prions, like reverse origami. Do that, and we're one step closer to mending the misfolds of each protein until the threat of somnium becomes as distant as times before. Cameron closed the presentation on her feed. Unsure she could have explained her ideas any better, she returned to the table. We wish you luck. Chavez didn't betray any further thoughts, but she would be critical in her feedback, always patterning class assignments with the word expound. 2 students later, Lennox traveled to the dais. She made eye contact with Cameron before turning her back. It's all in the past. Everything we need. The similarity of her own words struck Cameron. She looked down at the tabletop to avoid making eye contact with her instructor. No matter what Chavez believed now, this didn't change anything. Lennox's presentation began with a photo of a birdman. They used these masks during the Black Plague to ward off disease, and in the beaks they added oils and fresh flowers and vinegar sponges to keep the scent of death from infecting the healers. Cameron released a breath. The mask made more sense than the vision of that man as a dreamer demon, or at least that's how Cameron would have explained to Graham if she were here to listen. When the presentation cleared from the classroom feed, Cameron looked up, neck stiff from sitting still. Lennox stared back. If modernized to meet the needs of Somnium, I think this could keep the threat of disease at bay. Her voice brightened. We'll bring back the honeybees. She offered a small smile, but it was more than that. This was an attempt to fulfill the promise they'd made when they were 12, and Graham wrapped them up in Cameron's birthday quilt. Lennox had traced the wings of the bee then, assuring Graham they would bring them back. For her. I'm not sure how this will cure disease, Miss Dupre, but we appreciate your research. Chavez's words softened in a way they hadn't for the other students. Aislinn squinted at Cameron when she shared the title of her own project, Trapped. Her first slide featured a spreadsheet linking lines between words. Unlike the other students, Aislinn walked in slow circles around the dais, stopping every few minutes to emphasize points in the presentation. This program will be designed to propagate phrases from dreams. If we can understand what they mean, maybe we can banish them somewhere beyond and above. The cluster of words made little sense, but the title of the project stuck in Cameron's head. She struggled to focus on the rest of her friend's proposal because of that one word, which reminded her of the phallode stuck in the unit at the clinic. Her thoughts clouded with worry about her arm and the test results, and the possibility that she couldn't finish her project because she would stage into sickness. When it was Niall's turn, he shared countless sketches of lenses. Hack's tech could be better. What followed had little to do with Somnium, but his improvements promised a more immersive experience from wearable tech, blurring the lines of reality. He returned to his seat, mumbling about potential. Kane's string of code resembled the intricate lines inside a bee's wing. This has the ability to record the phallode as they dream without compromising neural safety. He broke down each part of the code. Once introduced into feeds, this can help us unlock the mystery of the mortality rate in those who reach the final stage of Somnium. Chavez stood. Just a thought, Mr. Pascal, but perhaps you and Miss Liu should pair up on this project. If integrated together, your code could be the way into the dreams, and Aislinn's program could translate the images into something quantifiable. Niles clapped loudest when Kane started back toward their table. Kane had been his only friend prior to the formation of their current group, and that familiarity persisted. When all 17 students from the senior class finished their proposals, Chavez closed herself behind the door to her office. No doubt she would request a virtual meeting with Dean Montgomery to discuss the results. As Hack's liaison, Montgomery bridged the gap between their current world and where they might go in the future. Cameron didn't think any one person should have that kind of power, but she promised herself before leaving for lunch that she would not give Montgomery a reason to question her potential. Cameron knew better than anyone what happened when a lack of purpose snuffed out a person's light.
There was a lot of really beautiful language in this. I loved inoculation stations. It has such a nice ring to it, that little rhyme. The sharp sense of antiseptic, all of the really visceral, sensory descriptors that you're using. I loved the moment when she's opening her locker with her fingerprint. It was a great moment of world building. And I really loved that you included that in there. I was slightly confused, and this might have just been me, but when, I think, was it Kane or Niles, I can't remember, came up to her and said, oh, we were going to get coffee, but we were waiting for you, and she said, oh, headache. I thought she didn't want coffee because she had a headache. That was my initial interpretation of that reply. But then, a few sentences later, she does want coffee. So if she's saying that she's late because she had a headache, then I only picked up on that later after she said she wanted coffee. I really loved the sentence beginning with faux freckles when you're describing that light. It was really beautiful. I was slightly confused by the sentence, the aroma of coffee stole her explanation, because she was trying to explain something about coffee or about how it was more than just a need for coffee that was the reason why she drank it so quickly, even though it was black. And so to me, it didn't really make sense why the smell of coffee would like distract her or make it more difficult for her to explain her thoughts. So I wasn't sure I really got everything I could out of that sentence. I really loved when she was talking with Lennox and she was using the Greek myths and the relay thief as a defense mechanism, really, so that she doesn't have to speak plainly about what's going on or their history. And I thought that was done really beautifully. I love the fact that Lennox understood perfectly what she was saying. It really showed that even though like their relationship has dissolved so badly, they still have this level of intimacy that comes with knowing someone for so many years since you were kids. So even when Cameron uses these like things to distance herself, that also shows how close they really were, and in a way always will be, even though their relationship has broken down. And then that line that Lennox gives toward the end, or it might be the last sentence actually, where she's like, "You're only half the person you used to be." I was like, ooh, man, that's a great line, but also what a burn. Love the description of Chavez. You have this way of describing her as both ethereal, but then also somehow dead inside, which is done really beautifully. I loved the turn of phrase, "without extending consequences." I just thought that was really lovely. When you said snapped back to reality, all I could think of was the Eminem song. Like, that's immediately what came to mind. That might just be me. I really like the turn of phrase, "stage into sickness." I thought that was a great little moment of world building, great use of words there. Overall, I thought this was a really clear chapter, good pacing, a lot of really great little world building moments that kind of stack up together here. I think it gave a really great sense of the world and of the relationships between these characters as they stand now and as they have been historically, which is really hard to do. And I had a much better understanding what Cameron was trying to achieve with her project through her explanation here than I have had in previous readings of chapters. I'm not sure if they were exactly analogous to this one, but it's been a long time. I thought that this was pretty clear, and it really gave me a better understanding of how that system and how that process of the projects is working and what role Chavez and Montgomery play in that, and how that's going to interact and potentially impact on Cam and the others' futures. So I thought that was really well done and great chapter.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to hear, though, that your understanding of Cameron's project works better, because I completely revamped how she explained it because it was just so confusing. So I'm glad to know that that translated well. I don't know that the line before the whole coffee description existed beforehand, so I might have just created a new issue that was never in here before. The reason why she stops talking is because she knows that it's Lennox, like that smell is Lennox's smell, so I think I can do something either the line before or in that line to clear that up. And then the headache line was just, that's why she didn't go, because yes, Niles talks too much. It wasn't actually about the coffee, so I can look to see if there's a way to clarify that. But I'm glad that the world is really clear. That's something I've been trying to do in the line edits, is just make sure everything makes sense, because it is such a detailed world and we haven't even gotten to like the crazy stuff yet. So I'm glad to know that this was successful.
I think it was. I remember a version of this chapter, and I know it was this chapter because they all gave the summaries of the projects they were going to do. And I remember thinking, is a really important plot element, and I felt sort of upset with myself that I didn't understand it better, and this time I did understand it much better, and I feel like you really have improved not just Cameron's descriptions, but some of the other ones too. Made them understandable, made them relatable, I think, maybe, because it made them, that the students presented them in such a way that they reflected their own personalities, but they also encompassed the world, the universe in your story. That it has kind of swept us up by this point, and it continues to make sense, these various facets that are focused on by the individual students. So I thought this was a big improvement. You're doing a really good job of portraying personality in the individuals in Cameron's group, or maybe I'm just doing a better job of hearing it now, but the way Aislin's got this snarky tone, I started to really get it now, and how Lennox has this way of getting to Cameron even when she doesn't necessarily mean to, or that her words are more sharply felt by Cameron than maybe Lennox means to be. Super impressed by Penumbra. And I want to say, actually, that I thought, okay, she's half of what she used to be. That's a great explanation of it. And then I looked up the definition of penumbra, and I realized that it actually means the shadow part. So I wonder if you wouldn't maybe even want to build the word shadow into that, rather than saying you're half of what you used to be. Maybe you could say half of you is in shadow now, or something like that. Just a suggestion. Chavez also was really well defined now. A fantastic moment where Chavez looked like lifeless, and then Cameron is immediately flashing on something to do with Graham's bones, or Graham telling a story about bones, and it was an eerie transition. It was one of those very atmospheric transitions that you sometimes use where Cameron seems to stray from the real world into some world that only belongs to her. When she makes her presentation, she uses the phrase, "a beginning untarnished by stories." And it was intriguing to me because she is very focused on stories, and I wonder, how does it come to be that stories become the tarnish rather than the fundamentals, because that's the way I sort of always felt of her before, was that she sees stories as being fundamental to everything, yet here she talks about stories as being like the tarnish that obscures it. And, I can see how she could have that point of view, but she didn't go very far with that, and I'd be interested to know more about, how she feels maybe the culture has created these stories that have artificially attached themselves to the disease, and what is actually behind that are more truthful stories, maybe you could say. Very impressed by the quality of your work here, Kayla.
Thank you so much. I'm happy that you did pick up on the way that the beginning, Untarnished by Story, stands out, because obviously what we know of Cameron in much later chapters is that she can't survive without stories. So I did want to make this very clear delineation where she has lucid, I think, moments. She hasn't quite descended into the madness that we know her to encompass. And she very clearly states in chapter 4 that Graham was the one that used stories to survive. So I wanted to make it very clear. Right now she understands the difference between truth and story, and I do think it is a good point. She could probably have another line to elaborate on what they know of the disease is what they've been told in stories. They weren't there for the beginning of it, and I think that is so interesting to look at when it's a disease that's been around for 20 years, and what she knows about the world is from stories. So I think she's very clear on that. So I think that is a good point to maybe loop in another line, but I'm glad that it stood out, because obviously stories are such an important part of character growth for Cameron, for better or for worse, and such a backbone of this book. I don't think it was your understanding of what the projects were before. It was just messy and very confusing. So I'm glad that all of that has now been clarified, because that was definitely the biggest pieces of work that I was doing in chapter 4 and chapter 5 to really set the groundwork for what's going to come later.
I honestly feel you could give Cameron a moment of self-awareness as she's presenting, in the midst of her presentation, and where she recognizes the strangeness of what she's saying, in her own mind. Because I also think that at this point in what she's proposing, she hasn't really worked it out yet. She's talking it through to a certain extent, and maybe she realizes that she is on the verge of some insight here that is a different way of thinking than she really has involved herself with previously.
All right, well, thank you so much.
All right, so I also do remember being at the meeting where we went over this a few years ago, and I do got to say that, like everyone was saying, not only did the projects come through much clearer, but I think everyone's motivations and what we're there for and all that stuff are much, much more defined. And I think, whatever it is that you really kind of not even distilled, but expanded upon, there's a lot of world building that wasn't in those first drafts. I really don't remember the blueberry nano muffins, but once you said blueberry nano muffins, I was sitting there for 3 minutes, trying to just imagine what those could be, like the several different types of things it could be. And I was like, what a cool concept. Like, is it like a chip that tastes like food, or is it actually a muffin that has like the chroma lenses are kind of like technology mixed with like biological things? So is this food like mixed with tech? Like, it was just little things like that. I don't recall those being in some of the first draft stuff. And I just thought you did, you were talking about Amanda doing it, and I think you're doing it yourself too when it comes to world building, and just like including these little things here and there that really make a person just kind of stop and think about it. Like the way you described Kane doing like the picture on the atrium, right, while it's raining and the drops are coming down, is really well done there. Just very cinematic. And I was kind of picturing it like a movie scenes picture. And I thought you nailed their banter really well. I felt like I was watching a high school conversation. It was like, so I felt those friendships coming through, and it felt very natural for chapter 4. When chapter 5 started, the first sentence kind of threw me off the way it was worded. It was something about tingling tech on Cameron's neck. I just thought maybe, just play with some word placement, maybe like the tech tingled at the back of Cameron's neck or something like that. Just kind of stopped me while we were reading. Death made a home in Graham's bones. I thought that, again, just really great imagery there, especially, just the use of that, and just the mental imagery I had with it. I love the way that you were talking about origami and proteins, and, kind of like figuring out something by going in reverse and breaking it down to what it was. And I thought that was a really great reference. Again, here in the classroom, this chapter specifically, and everybody's presentations and what they're going for came through very clear. I think what you added really heightened the sense of not only in some bits of competition. I felt like we're coming through between her and Lennox a little bit, but it just really kind of it made the world a bigger place for me. I love how you talked about her using the word expound in her presentation, because I always make fun of the ops manager that reports to me. He never uses the words dovetails in like real life, right? But in like every time he speaks in a meeting, dovetails comes up. This dovetails into this, blah blah blah. And I'm like, Anthony, everything doesn't dovetail into everything else. So I just bust his chops. But you're right. There is always, when we're like speaking to a group of people, there's always like these words or phrases we don't normally use like our normal talk, and we always do throw it in there. So I thought that was such a great little detail too. I did feel that in the first kind of few drafts until maybe a couple years ago, I always felt Cam was a little bit weaker of a character than those she surrounded herself with sometimes. I kind of felt like she was kind of Shelley Duvall Wendy in The Shining sometimes, but here actually I think not only in this draft but also you definitely brought it through the end of the revisions towards the end of the book that we were going through, a few months and a year ago. I think Cameron's character is much more defined, and here at the end of the chapter, we really see Cameron she wants to prove Montgomery wrong, like about what Montgomery thinks about her in the presentation. And I thought, it was a real defining moment, and I liked it a lot because I felt like I knew Cam a little bit better than I did before in the previous drafts. So I thought it was really good. And, like John was saying, Niles, Aislinn, and Kane, their characters, how you defined them and all that stuff, I thought it was just really well done. You could kind of tell who's who. Kane and Cam are texting about what Niles is saying, and it feels true to like a group dynamic in high school. And I just thought it was well executed. So I think overall the 2 chapters were really interesting to read, and I think the revisions that you're doing are really adding a lot of value to the story and enhancing it quite a bit.
Again, thank you so much everyone for your feedback. And I think what you're getting at was just Cameron's agency. Like, she really felt very passive, and like people would tell her things and she just kind of went along with it. So that was actually one thing that I wanted to clarify even last year working on it, to make sure that she felt like her own character. So I really wanted Cameron to feel like she had her own purpose for, going about doing things. She's setting out to create something that she thinks is so brilliant and has like every hope in the world that she will pass. But I'm glad that this all felt very clear, especially with the characters, because I didn't realize until I went back to do these line edits, but Niles actually never even showed up in chapter 4 and like was barely in chapter 5. And I'm like, okay, he's a very important character, so he needs to be in here a little bit more. So glad to know that the banter all felt very realistic. Those are obviously very fun moments to write, but I think oftentimes too, when you are writing high school characters not being in high school, you walk a really thin line of like, does this sound authentic and does this sound cheesy? So I'm glad to know that everything is working here. I'm excited because I am finally done with section 1. It's the first 10 chapters. I'm in section 2 now, just struggling every single day with chapter 12. But it'll happen. We'll get done. We'll see. I'm hoping to overcome it this weekend and get done with that chapter. It's difficult going from like fresh draft to line edits to having to add new information. So I think that's also where I'm struggling, where I'm like, I really just want to be tinkering and cleaning this up. I don't want to be drafting fresh material, but it's kind of where I'm at, and for it to make the most sense, I do need a couple of paragraphs of new material.
I think one thing that's true about your banter between your characters, which has always kind of fascinated me ever since the first time I started reading your book, is that it's very unconventional. And I think one of the, if you ever like worry about it being cliched or uninteresting, I never find it that way. And I think it's part of the reason is how Cameron just like filters everything that comes to her. And there'll be a line of dialogue and it'll seem to have one meaning, but Cameron goes off in some direction from it that puts a whole different significance on it. And so it's one of the things I admire about this book, and I think makes it really unusual.
Certainly something I love most. When I'm envisioning a scene, I get all the dialogue first. So a lot of times my skeletal drafts, it's just dialogue, and then I have to go back in and add in the character beat.
I actually think one thing that's really interesting, and I had this in my notes, but I didn't mention it, this mechanism you use of the side chats, which I think of as texting, those always, they just come across as super clear. It's like, oh, okay, this person said this, and, it seems like it's, statement, response, it always makes sense. Whereas when you present your dialogue knowing the story context, it gets wrapped up in how Cameron is hearing it, and how she's like bouncing off it sometimes. I actually wanted to say how much I really admire those side chats as a story mechanism for you. They really add a lot.
Thank you. I can't wait to see how somebody is going to format these in like the finished book someday. Like, are they going to make them look like text messages? Are they just going to keep them as regular font? Something that I'm excited to see. And I'm not going to say if, when this book gets published, because 2022 is the year of manifestation, and every day I'm like, when this book gets published. Now that writing group is officially done for the day, I am going to look back through my notes, which I've taken in this large moleskin journal. This has been my writing group journal for the past couple of years, so it's nice to have all of the feedback contained in here. But I'm going to go through these notes and add them into the Trello cards that I have on my book board for chapter 4 and chapter 5. That way I have the feedback available whenever I need to look at it, and can really make sure that those couple of spots where there was some confusion are clarified in the chapters. All in all, I think the biggest thing that comes from being able to see my writer friends on a bi-weekly basis is just having that sense of connection. I've spoken about it before, but I think too often the life of a writer can be solitary. You're sitting and looking at a blank page alone, but having the opportunity to share your words and get feedback, but also to give feedback to other people whose writing means so much to you, is really one of my favorite things about being part of a writing community. Looks like our next meeting will be in 2 weeks, so I have some time to look at these chapters, to continue working on my own line edits, but I'm really happy with all of the feedback I got today. If there's anything specific you want to know about joining a writing group or the benefits of being in a writing group, let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and remember, no matter where the day takes you, dream big.